Okay, gentlemen, today we're going to talk about the Atlantic slave trade. We're going to cover just the lecture here, and then we'll talk a little bit more regarding a couple other things that are taking place with this. Sugar plantations and tobacco farms, though, is a huge reason for the slave trade that exists within the Atlantic world. Um, they demanded a large supply of workers to actually make them profitable for the owners. Um, the plan was to enslave Native Americans who were already here, but as we know, with dying from disease, warfare, just brutal treatment in general, that wasn't necessarily going to be an option. Um, the Europeans in Brazil, the Caribbean, and a lot of the southern colonies within North America will eventually turn to Africa for workers to get this demand that was necessary. So let's take a look at slavery in Africa. Um, this is not necessarily a new thing. Slavery had existed within Africa for centuries, but it was a very minor practice at that point in time. The spread, though, of Islam into Africa during the 7th century, though, does usher in an increase in slavery and in the slave trade itself. You would start to see Muslim rulers in Africa justifying slavery with the Muslim belief that non Muslims are prisoners of war and they could be bought and sold at that point in time. So when we look at Africa as a whole, we start to see that people are sent out in slavery into other places. Generally speaking, a lot of times women are actually more valued than the men were because they were used in things like homes and they were used to kind of create a almost a servant like thing within the home, and so women were actually in much bigger demand in Muslim lands, even as far as you go to the Ottoman Empire and into the Middle East as well. So this is nothing new. And as a result of this, between 650 and between 650 and 1600, Muslims are going to transport about 17 million Africans to the Muslim lands of North Africa and Southwest Asia there. There are some legal rights that those slaves do have, and there's an opportunity for social mobility as well. You would even see that some slaves have a position of power at some times, some serving as generals within the army. And in African society, slaves could escape their bondage in numerous ways. One of those ways being uh, through marriage. The first Europeans to explore Africa are the Portuguese during the 1400s there. And initially, they were more interested in trading for gold than captured Africans. But that changes as colonization comes. The need for workers in the Americas is huge. It raises the demand for Africans. Um, they see an advantage to using Africans. They can withstand diseases. They had some farming skills and they were unfamiliar with terrain, so they're much less likely to escape. When we look at slavery within the Americas, we see that there's more of a need for male slaves within the Americas than there were females, and the reason for that was because of the fact that they were usually doing some type of backbreaking work. So the Atlantic slave trade itself um, really is going to push its way. It's the forced movement of Africans to the Americas first and foremost. Between 1500 and 1600, we're going to see about 300,000 Africans that are transported to the Americas. During the next century, that number climbs up to almost 1.3 million. So by the time the Atlantic slave trade ends in 1870, Europeans are going to import about 9.5 Africans to the Americas against their will. And that's the key thing to remember about this, guys. This is against their will. They are treated as property and not as humans. And so that's the biggest reasoning behind this. So, what are the causes of African slavery? Spain and Portugal are the ones who are going to lead the way. By 1650, you have about 300,000 enslaved Africans in the Spanish colonies, and Portugal brings in many more slaves than does Spain because of the sugar plantations that existed in Brazil. So those two groups are really going to dominate it. More than 40% of all Africans, though, brought to the Americas are going to go to Brazil. Brazil alone. So you're talking about a huge number of people from Africa who are going to be a part of this. The example of the map there that you see is what's known as the triangular trade. There are several different routes that it can take place with, but it's known as the triangular trade in which these groups of people come through in this time. And we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a second. So from 1690 to 1807, England is going to dominate the slave trade. You're talking about 400,000 enslaved Africans who are brought to the North American colonies. By the time the slave trade ends, you're going to talk about 1.7 million Africans to their colonies within the West Indies as well. So England really does do a huge part of this in dominating that slave trade. Once in North America, though, the slave population steadily grows. So you're talking about 1830, you have 2 million slaves within the United States alone. And slavery really begins with the development of farming about 10,000 years ago, and farmers would use prisoners of war to work for them. And so we understand that slavery had existed for a long time. It goes all the way back to Egypt and China and India as well. But the race is not always a factor within slavery. Most of the time, it's early on. It's because of prisoners of war or people from a different nationality and not necessarily African. The European version of slavery, however, does incorporate Africans and people who are Black. They look at them as naturally inferior. And so, because of this, within slavery in the Americas, it is very much hereditary and who you were as a part of it. There is African cooperation and there's resistance to it as well. Many African rulers and merchants played a very willing role within slavery. Most European traders don't travel inland. What happens is they wait on the coasts in ports while Africans are actually brought to them by their own people, and then they are sold in exchange for things like gold, guns, other goods as well. So as the slave trade really grows, many African rulers continue to participate in this as a part of it. Later, you'll see that some rulers will eventually protest to the actual slave trade itself, but that's not until later on. They were making a profit off of the slave labor portion of this. So when we talk about this, it's a forced journey, and we look at this known as the triangular trade. It's a trading network that links Europe, Africa, and the Americas together. And this is just one example of it. We're showing you the example that leads into North America here. So over one trade route, you would see Europeans transporting manufactured goods to the west coast of Africa. So things that had been made in Europe go down to Africa. Things like textiles, rum, all of those types of things that would go to Africa. Once in Africa, they are traded, okay, those goods would be traded for captured Africans. And those captured Africans would then move from Africa to the Americas, okay? And when they get to the Americas, they trade there for things like sugar, coffee, and tobacco within the West Indies. And then they would sail with those products back to Europe. So you could see the triangular portion of this trade here. The reason it's become known as the Middle Passage, it was the middle leg of the triangular trade. That's how we get the name Middle Passage for this. This is not just the only route that was taken, but it was the most common of them. The Middle Passage brought the captured Africans to the West Indies and then North and South America as well. And so the Middle Passage is actually a very difficult time period for these African prisoners who are put onto these boats. You're talking about 20% of Africans who would die on those journeys. The cruelty that exists within this is characterized in this photo here. But in African ports, European traders would pack on as many captured Africans as they could in order to really push these things into it. Dark holes of ships, holds of ships is where they would go. On board, you would see whippings and beatings from the merchants, disease going throughout the entire vessels. And just imagine this type of outcome here. Where are you supposed to, go to the restroom? Things like that are taken in. There are not those options at all times. So disease runs rampant here. And when we talk about 20%, that's a huge number. All right, a huge number within this portion. There's others who are going to commit suicide by drowning within this time period as well. They are just unwilling to take this trip. So the whole itself, just packing these people in as much as they could, because they look at it as profit, and the more you can carry, okay, then the more they can get from this. And that's this is one of the saddest portions of slavery that I look at, is not necessarily that the Middle Passage itself, but the fact that each one of these people is not necessarily looked at as a person. They are looked at as value. All right. And that is where we get the biggest issue that comes from this. Once in the Americas, all right, captured Africans are going to be sold at auction to the highest bidder. After being sold, their life is very difficult. They could be working in mines, they could be working in fields, they could be working as domestic servants. But just imagine if you are traveling here, you are separated, possibly even separated in Africa from your family, or once you get here, you could be sold to a different owner based on family at times. So you're actually thinking about this, and not just now, you're looking at it as yes, I'm selling someone into slavery, but I'm also separating them from their family, from the things that they knew for so long. And then I'm going to force them to do work that is demeaning in a lot of ways and for no pay. And they don't care if you lived or died. At that point, as long as you were able to give them something. That is the harsh reality behind slavery, and that I don't think we talk about enough. So when we look at the horrors of slavery, we're talking about Africans who develop a way of life that's based on their cultural heritage. There is resistance and rebellion to slavery, and we understand that. They try to maintain the fact that that there is some type of way to keep their own traditions alive. Maybe it's through music, through culture, some of those ideals there as well. Some are going to resist by breaking tools or working very slowly when their owners want them to push forward. And then you do have some who run away and take part in revolts as well. Generally speaking, none of those revolts are actually successful. As one has it from your book, in 1522, 20 slaves in Hispaniola attack and kill several Spanish colonists there. You do have larger revolts that do exist. Most of the time, guys, though, they are not successful in any way, shape, or form. What are the consequences of the slave trade itself? Results within Africa and the Americas. You have African societies who suffer from the loss of so many people. Generally speaking, the fittest members of their culture are going to be sold off. They're young and able, are going to be given away. You have families that are disrupted as well, as I told you. Many of them are never reunited. And so the slave trade really devastates the African societies, um, by introducing guns into the continent as well, because they would trade people for these guns. Um, African slaves do contribute economically, which is one thing about it, and the cultural ideals within America as well. But we can't underestimate the fact that the greatest thing that they do contribute is labor, and it's forced labor. That is the one thing that I want you guys to keep. As much as slavery becomes a big part of this, it was slave labor that was a huge part of this. Um, with the culture that comes in, and so many different people coming to the Americas, they leave a very big population portion to this. From the United States to Brazil, many of the nations of the Western Hemisphere have a very large population of African descent. Many Latin American countries have a sizable mixed race population as well. So the population that changes within this. We're going to talk more after this about social justice and things like that after this lecture and in class. And we're going to look at this, the social aspect of what took place throughout this time here. When we come back next day, we'll talk more about the Columbian Exchange and global trade. We'll include slavery in that because it's a part of the exchange as well. But this is another big topic. So the next two, the section 3 and section 4, become very big topics that we are going to discuss.